Welcome, everyone, to the Idaho Way. I'm Scott McIntosh, opinion editor for the Idaho Statesman.
And I'm Brian Clark, opinion writer.
This week, we are talking about a zoning code rewrite that is being undertaken by the city of Boise.
Yeah, public hearings are going for that rewrite right now. It modernizes the zoning code and brings it into agreement with the city's comprehensive plan. It aims to increase the density and diversity of housing types throughout the city. It would allow developers to build up to 4 units on a residential lot, would reduce minimum lot sizes as well. Developers could build up to 12 units near mixed-use districts. Denser development would be allowed along public transit corridors and in activity centers, leading to larger apartment complexes with a mix of retail, commercial, and residential development. The city is also using the zoning code rewrite to incentivize developers to set aside a certain number of units for affordable housing and to get builders to use sustainable materials and building practices.
Joining us this week to talk about the issue is Tim Keane. He is the planning director for the city of Boise. Tim Keane, thanks for joining us this week.
Scott and Brian, thank you for having me. This is perfect timing, of course.
Right, the hearings are going on. You've had two public hearings now so far. There's another one scheduled for tonight, another one scheduled for tomorrow night. I guess let's start off, Tim, just tell us what the city hopes to accomplish. Why is the city doing this zoning code rewrite?
Well, Brian spoke to it in the introduction. The most important aspect of this is that the city created a plan back in 2011, and that was a significant event for people in Boise. The residents of the city created something called Blueprint Boise, which really was such an important decision by the community because it was seeking to ensure that the city grow in a way that addresses the big issues that cities face. So things like housing affordability and transportation and how do you protect the environment. Blueprint Boise was really about those issues. And the reason we're updating the code is because ever since 2011, that zoning update has not occurred. The city hasn't gotten around to making sure its rules are in conformance with its plan. So we're now finally getting to that, and that's why we're doing this.
And what lessons has the city learned from other cities that have undertaken similar processes? Are there any mistakes that other cities have made that you're trying to avoid?
I think there's a couple things I would mention first, and one is that we have to have many solutions in this ordinance to deal with these tough issues, as I said, housing affordability, transportation, environment, dealing with climate and these kinds of things. We have to have lots of solutions. There isn't one solution. And that's a lesson from other cities because you've seen lots of headlines about cities taking one action in furtherance of addressing all those issues. And we know we can't take one action. We need multiple solutions to those problems. And the second thing I'll mention is that a lesson from other cities, and there'll be 3. The second one is that the ordinance has to be designed to accommodate this very specific city. This ordinance we're proposing is not theories. It's not like ideas that you could apply anywhere. It's really organized around this specific city. Like, where do we need density in Boise where it would be helpful? Where can we put? So it's organized around this specific city. That's the second thing. And the third thing I'll mention is that is again a lesson from other cities, and Boise has already taken the big step in this direction, is we have to address these issues before we grow substantially. We've seen growth in Boise, of course, and it's a growing city and region. But Boise's taking action before things get so out of control that really it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle. You know what I mean? Like so many cities, and we've even heard this come up at our public hearings this week that people speak to. I'm sorry, but the growth there had gotten too far decades ago, and now they're seeking to repair things. In Boise's case, we can actually create the rules that address those big issues before we're so far down the road that you're really repairing damage that's been done. So those are the lessons I think that are important from other cities.
what do you say to the criticism that the rewrite tips the scales too much in favor of developers? There's a lot of entitlement by right, and it allows developers to do a lot more in single-family residential, and that it takes residents out of the public hearing process, that allows developers to do stuff without public input. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, the first thing I'd say about this ordinance is that the ordinance we have, remember, dates to 1966, the current ordinance. So we're 60 years later. And the most important part about this process, starting with Blueprint Boise, but now with the zoning ordinance, is how do we make sure that in this ordinance, we're getting what the community wants and needs? That's the most important thing. So part of that is our approval processes. Like how do we create processes that make what we want and need easier to do? So when you speak about how people are involved in the process, the way we've designed our process is to let the community participate in making this ordinance successful, which means in some cases that we actually involve people when people are not developing dense enough. You know what I mean? This is the whole idea of allowed use, allowed form. But the bigger point is just that we make sure that our approval processes involve residents in ways that are helpful and not just delaying things, but actually get us to better outcomes. And with regard to developers, there's so much in this ordinance that is the opposite of that. It's not about developers. It's about giving more people an opportunity to participate in the growth of the city. What I mean by that is there's aspects of this ordinance that deal with things like accessory dwelling units, which is a garage over your apartment or a garage in your basement or something like this. And it deals with what has traditionally been part of older neighborhoods in Boise, which is you have single homes, but then you also have a duplex, or you have a building that has 4 units in it, or you have a courtyard apartment, or you have, those kinds of things, a variety of housing that actually is very appropriate in the neighborhood. Well, that's not really for developers. That's more for, people that could get into that business, whether you own a house and you want to do a separate unit on your property, or you want to create a couple of units, or small scale people that are in development and building that really are community minded and are trying to build more affordably. So much of this ordinance, especially the neighborhood aspects of it, are really for people that aren't really in the development business in a big way. When you think about developers being someone that's got private equity and's got all this kind of financing and things. But there are all the other aspects of the ordinance that we think are not. You mentioned the mixed use zones, and we've got a zone that is tied to our corridors like State Street and Vista and so forth, and Fairview. And that's an area that if we want to make sure that in this code, because we'll always have developers in the city, but we want to make sure this code gives clear direction to developers as to what we want. And that's what this code does. So it says, hey, along Vista, where we have big surface parking lots and in some cases even vacant buildings, it would sure be helpful to have that being used for people, so it's designed for apartments and mixed use and these kinds of things. We want to make that easy. And so the aspects of this that deal with, what you might consider to be traditional developers, the beauty of this is that we're telling developers what we want as a city. And then it's most helpful to ensure that that's easier to do. Now, if a developer wants to do something that's not in concert with our plan and our zoning, then they would still have to go to public hearings. Now you're at the Planning and Zoning Commission, you're at City Council, and you got to convince us why what you're proposing is contrary to our plan and our ordinance. So we'd still have that, of course. But the provisions of this, which allow more density very surgically, very thoughtfully, are the things that we want. So we want developers helping us, not just, to be in conflict with them.
And so, sort of on the other side, what do you say to folks who think that you might not be moving aggressively enough to encourage new density? Obviously, housing prices, rental prices have gone through the roof in Boise in recent years. Do you think you've gone far enough to deal with that issue?
It's a great point, and Scott and Brian and others listening, if you've paid attention to our first 2 nights of public hearings, what you've seen is a wide variety of opinions on these topics, like especially as it relates to density and it relates to parking and density in the sense that how that affects housing affordability and all those kinds of things. And we really, to your question, Brian, we really like where we ended up in this. And I know we have some that think we should go further, but we really like the structure of this ordinance. What I mean is, again, the way we've organized the neighborhoods, the fact that we kept all of our neighborhood zoning, which are called R1s, but we've kept all of those. We found multiple ways to do a greater variety of building types in those neighborhoods. That includes, again, a small apartment building or a garage apartment, all that kind of stuff. So we found multiple ways to add to our neighborhoods that are appropriate for neighborhoods. We really like the mixed use districts we've proposed. We think the mixed use districts are so commensurate with how the city ought to grow. So we feel wholeheartedly like we got to the right place when it comes to those things. We really like the market, the neighborhood market and cafes, that we're proposing to allow. We really like the affordability and sustainability standards that Brian referenced in the opening. We think those are all really good, not just okay, but really good. The things we think we'll need to monitor get to your issue, Brian, which is a year from now, we expect to come back and say, are those affordability incentives working? Are we getting the affordability that we want? So there are aspects of it that we know we'll need to tweak, but those are details. Like, is the affordability incentive working? Did we land right on the parking? Which, again, last night, huge opinions in either direction on parking. Some saying we shouldn't require any parking. Some saying we needed a enormous amount more of parking. So the question will be going forward is, did we get that right? How's that working? And especially as it relates to the housing affordability piece. So in listening to folks that say we're not going far enough, I think what they might be missing is that there's multiple avenues. Unlike, as I said, what we've learned from other cities, this isn't a one solution ordinance. It is a multi-solution ordinance. And sometimes what I hear in terms of criticism about going not far enough, I want to say, well, but you're only looking at one aspect of the ordinance. This isn't a one solution ordinance. It's a multi-solution ordinance. We think the strategic infill is very important when it comes to that affordability issue, for instance, and that doesn't get much discussion, but it's a huge addition to this that we think is critical to getting to the housing affordability and diversity. So I think where we landed is in an ideal place, but I think with some of those details, just the details, we'll want to come back and keep checking. Are we getting the affordability we need? But we have the structure of an ordinance that will last, that will be durable, that is reflective of how we want the city to grow.
So I wanted to ask you to address concerns about the potential of changing the character of neighborhoods. So somebody buys a house in, on the Bench or in West Boise or the West End, and they purchase a house. They've got the nice tree-lined streets and single-family residences in the blocks around their house. And then a developer comes in and purchases a house and tears it down and builds a fourplex or a sixplex if they're allowed to. And now that person is like, well, I didn't sign up to live next door to an apartment building. I want to live next to a house. And so they sell their house and move somewhere else. And now a developer buys their house. And there's a little bit of a domino effect that you see. And all of a sudden, a little neighborhood in the West End that used to be all these cute little single family cottages and bungalows is now a strip of fourplexes and sixplexes, destroying the character of that neighborhood. How do you address that concern? And doesn't this rewrite incentivize that to some degree?
Well, let me speak to that, Scott. Thank you for the question. The first thing to say is that the zoning ordinance does not create growth. To be clear about that, this we're not creating rules that would result in this great change that would be growth in Boise and the Treasure Valley. We're not doing that. It's a question between one kind of change and another, right? Because we're growing and we'll continue to grow. Now, the economy is in a different place right now. We'll have cycles up and down, but the trajectory is towards growth, and that's not just Boise, but the region. So that's number one. But related to that, the phenomenon that we're seeing and will continue to see, to your point about the West Side or any neighborhood that, as you described it, Scott, is what we're seeing, and we'll see more of, is the demolition of existing modest houses in those neighborhoods with their in replacement by much larger houses for single families. That's what we're facing. And that means a bigger footprint on the lot. That could mean destruction of trees. Basically, you're replacing the scale of your city is going away, but what's replacing it is just much more expensive large houses. That's the phenomenon we're dealing with, and it will ramp up. This is a lesson from other cities. That will happen more and more, and that's why I say it's so important Boise's doing this now, because if we get too far in that direction, which we're getting close to, if we get too far in that direction, it becomes so much harder to go now in and try to fix things. If we do it now, what I would say is what you're talking about is we'll have many more cases of where we are replacing single family homes with multiple units, which means dwellings of different types and sizes, and inherently to that you get more diversity and different kinds of people. You're helping people of all kinds, whether it's age or where they are in life or job or income level. You're just baking in a lot more diversity in terms of how you do things. And with regard to trees and kind of the residentiality of these neighborhoods, we chose to find multiple ways to do types of buildings that we traditionally have had in Boise neighborhoods. You're not talking about 6, 7-story apartment buildings everywhere. That's not what this is. This is, go to our older neighborhoods and you will find smaller apartment buildings, and you will find buildings with 4 units in them. You will find cottage courts. You will find buildings in the back of a house that has an apartment in it. That's what we're seeking to do. And in that environment, you'll see those are some of our most tree-lined streets, and our best tree canopy is in neighborhoods like that. When you build on a lot, whether you replace a modest home with a much larger mansion or you replace that modest home with 3 units, there are cases where you lose a tree. What you end up doing is you plant new trees, and then eventually that becomes canopy. Well, what we're proposing for our neighborhoods is that type of building. You can have the phenomenon you described, Scott, and result in just one big house, or you can have the phenomenon you described and you've got multiple houses of a variety. When you're dealing with housing affordability, we feel that's what you must do, is give yourself more choices and more variety. And again, it doesn't create the growth. If you choose to not do that and you choose the path of just replacing single homes with much bigger single homes, we know what results is you sprawl across the landscape. That's the lesson from other cities, which Boise has this moment to try to work against, which really, really creates natural problems and transportation problems and affordability. We will have failed if, in order to afford a home in Boise, you have to drive further and further from the city, deeper and deeper into the desert or wherever, into the farmland. We will have failed if that happens. And this ordinance, seeking to allow this variety within neighborhoods appropriately, and the mixed use stuff, which is denser, is seeking to avoid that problem from the beginning.
And so it's obviously from a developer's perspective, it can be a less profitable proposition to build affordable housing. How confident are you that the measures in this code in this code rewrite will provide sufficient incentives and rules to make sure that there is enough affordable housing being built.
One thing I'd mention about the incentives is we really built in the incentives within the neighborhood zones. So that would be back to the R1, but all of our neighborhoods are zoned some kind of R1. And so the incentives are heavily directed towards those neighborhood zones. So in cases where you're building, for instance, 4 units, 2 of them have to be designated for affordability. And I'll get to what that means in a minute. Also the strategic infill, which has a affordability and sustainability component to it. That's a neighborhood zoning. So the incentives are really directed to smaller scale development and honestly in that realm, and we'll have to check on it. To my point earlier, we'll have to monitor these incentives to make sure they're working. But I think there's smaller, builders that are seeking to build more affordably, and you have individuals with properties that could potentially add units where they're this isn't a big developer business, it's smaller efforts to build affordably. And we think that type and that scale of development more naturally brings itself to address where we are, which is essentially 80% of area median income. And I'll speak to that in a second. But anyway, so we feel good about the way the incentives are structured. But to the question, Brian, it's a good point. We want to make sure that they're calibrated properly, and we'll have to keep monitoring that. But you got to remember, I want to mention one thing about housing affordability that relates to the zoning ordinance. To deal with housing affordability in Boise, we have to do many, many, many things that don't just include the regulations. So for instance, right now, Mayor McLean has been the first mayor in the city that has invested in housing affordability proactively. So we through the mayor and city council, which has dedicated funding to housing affordability for the first time in the city's history. So public money to help with housing affordability. First time in Boise's history. We must do that. Where the regulations step in is our zoning code should, number one, increase supply of housing, which is absolutely needed, but also get to the private market building housing essentially between 80 and 120% of area median income. Because when you get below 80% and you get to 60% or 50 or 30%, in those cases, there's going to be some other public involvement, like funding or public property, those kinds of things. The zoning ordinance must help us with that 80 to 120, which is people that are working. It's a household that maybe has 1 or 2 people that are working a service job. So you're working in a restaurant, you're working a lower level position, maybe at a hospital, whatever, you're working for the city, you're a fireman or policeman. The private market should serve those people. And right now it can't. And so this ordinance would help with that, because there are many cities in this country where they're spending public money on 80 to 120% of area median income. That would be a shame in Boise's case. We need to reserve that public money that the city for the first time has dedicated to those making less than 80% of median income, and let the zoning ordinance get us that 80 to 120. So it's something to monitor, but I think we feel very good about the structure of this ordinance. We just got to make sure it's working as we move forward.
And that's the missing middle that people are always talking about with housing policy.
It certainly is. That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got a ton of questions, and we're going to run out of time for sure. But I want to get to parking, because I definitely want to talk about parking. But we've got a couple questions from folks about parking, and but I want to start with design review. I want to ask about how does the design review factor in with the new code? What's preventing somebody from, tearing down a house in a residential neighborhood and putting up, corrugated steel 4-unit structure that looks god awful? Is there any backstop and protection from making that building just look awful and not congruent with the existing neighborhood?
Well, it's a very important point for me, in part because design is so important in the city, and that by design, I mean architecture, the quality of our buildings is such an important aspect of being a great city that people feel good about growth within. If we don't design exceptional buildings, regardless of what our density is, people are not going to like what's happening. I mean, we've got to do that well. So there is a concentration on our design review commission in this ordinance, which actually elevates the stature of our what is now committee to commission. And some of our approval processes are aligned to give them more responsibility for design review. So we think that's a very important part of it. So in cases where you're doing smaller scale development, the design review would be done at the staff level. When you get to a certain threshold, like for instance, if you're building more than 50 apartments anywhere in the city, you do have to go to the design review commission, which is a public hearing. Everybody gets to see it. So larger scale, multifamily, commercial would go to an elevated design review commission, which we're very cognizant of getting that commission even better at getting great architecture. So it's a very important point. I do think, people have different ideas about architecture, but we're getting very commensurate or aligned with the very issue you're raising. Is we've got to get to appropriate. You can have differences of opinion in terms of architecture and style, but we've got to make sure the scale is right. And there's aspects of this ordinance that deal with that. For instance, we have transitions. If you got a 1-story house next to a 3-story house, that you got to step things back. But we have examples of where that's been very well done in Boise. So the design part of it is essential. But I think you got to remember, somebody could come in next to you right now, tear down a house and build a massive mansion that looks like hell. I mean, so it's not like we have this perfect condition now. Again, it gets back to, it's change. It's what kind of change would you prefer, and we got to try to be good at either one.
Okay, and so I do want to get to parking because, if you talk about increasing density, some of these neighborhoods, they're already struggling. Everybody's got 3 cars per household or 4 cars per household. And however much the city would like people to bike and walk to work, that's just not a reality. And throwing more cars in some of these residential neighborhoods is going to cause a problem. How do you address the parking issue?
Well, let me first say that in this proposed ordinance, we have really done a moderate change to our parking requirements. This is not a dramatic change that we're proposing. The only real big change we're proposing, I mean, it's moderate too, but is within our like a single house or 2 units or 4 units, small scale residential. We've reduced the parking requirement from 2 spaces per unit to 1. Otherwise, we have some parking maximums for commercial uses, like if you have a grocery store in a mixed-use district, that you not build more than 125% of the minimum. So there's some maximums in there, but I would characterize this ordinance as modestly changing the off-street parking requirements. So you heard over the first 2 nights some that say we should eliminate parking minimums by the city, and some that say we need way more parking. So we've ended up in a very moderate position. But let me say this about parking. So we've built cities around parking for decades. Most of the cities that people point to as ones that we don't want to become, the one thing they have plenty of is parking. So you point to any city that you say, wow, we shouldn't do that. I guarantee you they have massive surface parking lots everywhere. So we got to be careful about this. We had started with, let's move towards eliminate minimums, because if you don't have a minimum parking requirement, it doesn't mean that parking isn't provided. Of course it is in most cases. It's just that the public, the community, through its regulations, is not requiring you to. And the reason for that is that parking is expensive. Even surface parking, you think about it. I mean, if you had a 6-unit building, for instance, right now, you tried to build in a neighborhood, under the current ordinance, you'd have to have 12 parking spaces. That's not really realistic on a residential lot. Or get to the mixed use zones, you're going to be building parking that's structured, and structured parking can cost $40,000 a space. So immediately you're increasing the cost of the housing. The issue really, though, is this: we have to become a city where people don't have to drive so much, where people have choices, where they can walk to some things, where they can ride their bike, where they can get on the bus. We must do that if we're to be successful. If you are frustrated with congestion, the way to solve that frustration is to build less parking, to make sure that some people can walk and not own so many cars that are so expensive. But this is a public service announcement. It's not an opinion. Look at 100% of the cities in this country and how they've grown. If we make it so that everyone must drive to do every single thing, then we will have failed. And the parking is a direct correlation to that, right? If we focus so much on parking and not people, that's a problem. So we ended up in a moderate place. There's opinions either direction. We'll see where we end up, but that's kind of the parking. Is that good on that, Scott?
I think that was a good explanation. I appreciate that. Well, the process continues. We've got 2 more Planning and Zoning Commission hearings tonight and tomorrow night, and I understand you expect the Planning and Zoning Commission to wrap up at least tomorrow and begin deliberations and possibly a decision by tomorrow.
Certainly, we'll be finished tomorrow. We'll see how tonight goes, and be flexible. Do we finish tonight, tomorrow night? We'll see. What depends on how long the deliberations are, and then it will go to City Council. So we'll have another series of public hearings just like this in June with City Council. So it's not your last chance.
And just to be clear, people can show up, go up to City Hall. The hearing starts at 5 p.m. tonight.
That's right.
And 5 o'clock, scheduled for 5 o'clock tomorrow night as well. And then City Council will be scheduled after that. I want to thank you, Tim, for joining us. This was helpful, and hopefully our viewers found it helpful. To our viewers, thank you for showing up. And you can sign up for my free weekly email newsletter, The Idaho Way, in the comments. And again, thank you to Tim Keane from the City of Boise for joining us this week. Thank you, Tim.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and have a great weekend.